Welcome to our reading on economics with me, Jonathan Bohm. Right, okay, what have we got in economics? First of all, it's 10% of the syllabus, so we're going to see approximately 24 questions on economics in the exam, split between microeconomics, macroeconomics, and foreign exchange. Now, typically with economics, you tend to find that either people have covered some of this material before, maybe in an undergraduate degree course, or they haven't, in which case economics is a very different proposition for different people. If you have seen some of this before, then fantastic, it's going to be a nice, easy area for you. However, I would still warn against skim reading. You need to make sure you've got the detail. You need to know how the CFA Institute actually tackle each topic. Now, of course, if you haven't done this before, then really it's quite a daunting prospect. Changes in any of the other factors, of course, will shift the supply curve as well. So notice an increase in supply shifts the supply curve out. Notice now that the firm is willing to supply more at any given price. Now, what will cause this to happen? Typically reductions in the price of, or the cost of, producing the goods and services. So if raw materials fall, if labour costs fall, if overheads fall. A decrease in supply typically is going to be caused by our exogenous factors rising in price. So raw materials essentially become more expensive, labour more expensive, overheads more expensive. Notice now, at any given price, the firm is willing to supply a lower quantity. Now, the next reading is really rather straightforward. It asks us, what is the process of aggregating demand and supply curves? Now, actually, we've been looking at demand and supply functions, first of all, so what we then need to do is just take our process on one step further to look at demand and supply curves. Now, first of all, our demand and supply function, we can see there that we've got a supply function. The quantity supplied equals 250 plus 2.5 px. So we've only got one factor in this model, and that's the price. Now, again, where do these numbers come from? Typically, it would come from regression analysis. Now, what we're looking at when we see our supply function there is a single firm. So how do we get supply for the entire industry? It's a dead straightforward process. All we're going to have to do is sum the supply functions. In other words, add the supply functions, add these equations for every firm within the industry. Now, let's imagine we've got 50 firms within the market. Now, we are going to make another assumption here. We're going to assume that they're all identical. In other words, they all have exactly the same supply functions. Okay, so all we're going to need to do is add this supply function 50 times to get the market supply function. So here we go. Market supply, therefore, must be, and again, this is the market supply function. And notice when we talk about function, the major output of our model is quantity. So let's just multiply our negative 250 by 50 and our 2.5 px by 50. And of course what we're going to get therefore is that the quantity supplied equals minus 12,500 plus 125 times the price of the good, px. Now again, that is the market supply function. If we want the market supply curve, there's a slight difference. Function has quantity as its output. The supply curve has price as its output. So we need to do a little bit of rearranging and solve for price. So notice if we invert this function and solve for price, then we find that price is equal to 0.008 times quantity plus 100. Now this, of course, is the equation of our supply curve. A box for us. Oops, I don't want grey, I want white. Hang on a second. There we go. Okay, let's just blank this slide out just for a second and write down our rules here. Okay, now these are the requirements for a stable equilibrium. And I want to really think about two scenarios here. I want to think about price being above the crossover point. What am I talking about when I say crossover here? I just mean simply where supply and demand intersect. Now, if price is above the crossover point, we need supply to be greater than demand. And we know why we need it, because this will force prices down and will move back towards equilibrium. So if the price is above the point where supply and demand intersect, then supply needs to be greater than demand, because that will force price back towards the equilibrium level. An unstable equilibrium would simply be a situation where demand is greater than supply, and yet price is above the crossover point. In other words, in that scenario, because demand outstrips supply, price would continue to rise. In other words, would move further and further away from our equilibrium, and hence would be unstable. Now, of course, if price is below our cross, then essentially, for a stable equilibrium, we need demand to be greater than supply, because of course that's going to cause our price to rise. Now, of course, therefore, unstable scenarios will be the reverse of this, where supply outstrips demand even though the price is below the crossover point, and that causes prices to fall. In other words, we move further and further away from our equilibrium points. Now let's have a little look at our diagrams then and see if we can now make sense of those. Now notice our first diagram. So here we are with our first diagram here. And notice this talks about stable equilibrium. Notice if our price, let's say, is above the equilibrium point, there's our equilibrium point. If our price is above, here is demand, here is supply. Supply outstrips demand, and we know that's going to force prices down. Again, if prices are below our crossover point, then notice that supply is lower than demand, and that's going to force prices up. So we're looking at a classic stable equilibrium. Let's look at our unstable equilibrium down here. Again, there's our crossover point where supply and demand intersect. Notice here, if price is above, here is supply, here is demand. Demand outstrips supply. And of course, when demand outstrips supply, prices are going to rise. In other words, we're moving further and further away from the equilibrium. With a price that is essentially the crossover point, here's demand, here's supply. We've got excess supply, which is going to force prices even further downwards. So descending price auction, you pay what you bid. Now let's compare that to a modified Dutch auction. And modified Dutch auctions are common in government bond issuance. We see it as the mechanism that's used to issue US treasuries. We also see it in the UK as the mechanism that the Debt Management Office uses to issue UK government gilts, which is just the UK version of a US treasury. So this is very common in government bond markets. Now notice, first of all, very common to a Dutch auction, we start with a price that is greater than what bidders are willing to pay. Then the auctioneer is going to systematically reduce that price until they hit prices where bidders are willing to pay. Again, the bidder is just going to be stating quantity here. Now the price is going to be further reduced until all is sold. Now hang on a second, all these points that we've just discussed here, so in other words, our first 4 bullet points, that sounds just like a normal Dutch auction, and it is. But here is the difference. So this is where you need to focus on for your modified Dutch auction. With our normal Dutch auction, each bidder paid the price that they'd actually bid. So in other words, each bidder is paying their own unique price. Here, we all pay a single price. Everybody pays the same price. And what is that price that we pay? It's the price that the last bid that's made that means all quantity is essentially sold. Okay, so in other words, we all pay the lowest price that cleared the quantity sold. And it's a single price to all. Non-competitive bids here, where bidders state quantity but not price. So in other words, you're not stating the price you're willing to buy at. And what you end up doing is paying the price derived from the modified Dutch auction. And again, they're saying this is the case of US treasuries. It's also the case for UK government gilts. They have a competitive market, which is just the modified Dutch auction, and a non-competitive market, normally a much smaller quantity of a government bond issue in the non-competitive market, where you just pay the price. You bid quantity and you pay the price from the competitive auction.